Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Luke. And let's get started. So on this cold winter morning over at Peking University and a warm sunny afternoon at Stanford, excited to kick off our second annual Faces Telesummit. And really excited to see a great turnout on both sides, and had a chance for everybody to introduce each other a little bit, so it's a much more homely feel now. It's not one of these formal sitting around with ties kind of thing, but really having a meaningful conversation together. My name is Stephen. I'm working currently at the Yenching Academy at Peking University. Some of you may have heard it's a new international scholarship program at Beta. We have our first cohort this year, 96 scholars from over 30 countries, doing a Master of China Studies, and really sharing many of the same hopes as Faces, promoting greater understanding between China and the world, and the dialogues in between. And I was also very fortunate to have been a Faces delegate last year, and so to really feel it's a privilege to be asked to be helping to be one of the moderators, and the way I think I've been asked to help set this talk today. I think it's really to see whether the Telesummit can be a way to continue some of the dialogues we've had since Faces, to have for more conversation and exploration into kind of uncharted territory. And I think while we're so lucky today to have such distinguished experts on both sides on topics of one-child policy, Planned Parenthood, but to really have a chance to then, as a starting point, to discuss further topics that maybe are unfamiliar to both sides, and to see whether we can discover new grounds together, and to especially to see if there are any potential connections and things like that across perhaps topics that usually aren't explored in different comparative perspectives. And so today's topic, women in a changing modernity, obviously it's quite a big topic, and but I think in some ways it's a very interesting one where we can not just focus on sort of the academic discussions, but then also to talk about some of the broader questions of how modern governments and societies are influencing the choices that women are making, or can make, and do make in the ways that, as we talk about some of the issues of demographics, culture, policy, and so forth, but also on a personal level as well. And so today, before I introduce our speakers, just very briefly on the structure, first we're going to have some opening remarks from our three distinguished panelists, Professor Xiaochun and Ms. Meredith. And we also have a fantastic moderator who will introduce us well on the Stanford side, Ling. And after the opening remarks, we'll then go into the second part, which will be kind of the reaction and sort of reflections based on some of the sharings from the two sides on these slightly different but also similar topics, on sort of what surprises you, what are some of the similarities, and so forth. And kindly on that side, we'll also provide some of the guided questions to focus on some of the themes. And then the last part will open up to our audience and hopefully have a good 30-45 minutes to really have a conversation where both our students on our Beta side and our Stanford side to really also engage with one another as well. So without further ado, let me just briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. First of all, Professor Xiaochun, and is a professor of Institute of Population Research at Peking University. Sir, welcome. He's also the executive editor-in-chief of the Journal of Population and Development, and the chief expert group of the UNFPA of the National Health and Family Planning Commission of China. Also the vice president of the China Population Association, a pioneer member as well of the International Network of Health Expectancy and Disability Process, and many boards. His research includes demographic analysis, aging, population research, social and population policy, and he has been in charge of over 20 research projects supported by the Chinese government. And in the 1990s, Professor Qiao was among the few who first realized and proposed that China's population problems has been changing from the scale of the population to the structure of age. And really, ever since, he's been one of the leading experts and has played a crucial role in government's policies towards demographics and so forth. So, extremely honored and very grateful. And then we have Professor Zheng. Professor Zheng is currently a professor at the Institute of Population and Labor Economics at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And before that, she was an associate professor at the Institute of Population and Research at Peking University. And she served as a consultant in the scientific and technical advisory group of the Department of Reproductive Health and Research at the WHO from 2006 and 2011. And she's currently a member of IUSSP and the Executive Council member of China Population Association. Her research interests are also very diverse and very rich, including statistical demography, population and gender studies, social science research and reproductive health. Her current research includes aging-related issues, fertility, intention, childbearing behavior, migration and rural women's development, migration, health, vulnerability. So quite a range and a really phenomenal. Her recent publication in English includes reproductive health and access to services among rural to urban migrants in China, with the United Nations, and another one, the choice of having a second child and its implications for future family structure in China. So also extremely honored and grateful. Thank you, Professor Zheng. I guess, Hanli, maybe I will introduce you, and then you can also then introduce Ms. Meredith.
Sure.
And I'll just briefly introduce Han Ling, who's also our second moderator, much more distinguished than I am. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California in San Diego, and right now her dissertation examines the uneven formation and development of social work profession in China that has come to dominate community welfare reform. She's also working on her book manuscripts, which investigates the embedded power dynamics and the transformative power of service provision NGOs in urban China. So really cutting across service, urban governance, nonprofit. And her other published works also includes very interesting topics on transnational ties, religious orientation, gender influence, social activism. So maybe we can work some of those topics in as well. And her new project is a comparative study of community change between China and America, which should be a very relevant. So great to meet you, Helen, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Okay, so it's really honored to have my center's executive director, Kim Meredith, here. She's the inaugural executive director of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, which we call PACS. And Kim has been responsible for the strategic leadership, strong financial performance, and consistent organizational growth for PACS. And Kim joined PACS in July 2009. 1 year later, led the team to acquire Stanford Social Innovation Review, SSIR. And thereafter, opened Stanford PACS at the Stanford Center at Peking University. And in fact, this year, in March, middle of March, we will host our annual workshop there at the SUPKU this year. So if any of the FACES member would like to help out, reach out to me and us. And so Ms. Meredith brings dynamic and innovative leadership to implement the missions of Stanford PACS and SSIR. And prior to joining Stanford PACS, Kim served as the Chief Development Officer for Planned Parenthood Federation of America in New York City. And before joining the PPFA, she served for 9 years as the Chief Operating Officer at Planned Parenthood in San Francisco. And Kim currently serves on the board of directors of the California Family Health Council, awarding grants of $20 million annually for women's health. The George Lucas Education Foundation, Utopia, illuminating and showcasing what works in education, and the Intai Research Center of Philanthropy and Social Impact at the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University. And her teaching skill also focused on the future of nonprofit and foundation leaders. And Kim graduated from Stanford University with a BA in economics. In 2005, she received a fellowship to the Stanford Graduate School, a business executive program for nonprofit leaders. So Kim's experience has been cross-cutting different sectors, now the nonprofit, the gender, and also in various fields. So we are really honored to have her here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, with that, without further ado, let's perhaps kick off with the opening remarks with Professor Qiao to share findings.
Okay, thank you. I'm very glad to be here. I think that because this time we have the topic dealing with one-child policy. So I think that I should try to give some background of plan programs in China, and also I'd like to talk something about changing of plan policy in China. First, I think that you may know that when China was founded, the population increase in China is very fast. From 1949 to 1970, that is, that's within 20 years, China's population increased 50%. That is very high interest rate, in China. So and at that time, China is under a flying economy because economic system is different as now. A flying economy means that the government provides all the support to the people, including their food, their clothes, and their housing, and even their jobs. The government feel very strong pressures, for the huge, population. At that time, that we may know that in China we have an event that the young people in urban area have to be, sent down to the countryside. That's mostly because of the, there's a limited of the job in China. It's very, the government feel very hard to give every young people a job at that time. So that's why the government feel very strong pressures on the population. So they make decision to have the family planning. The family planning program started in early 1970. That's the period that Cultural Revolution at that time. I think that you may know that Cultural Revolution in China means what? It means they do nothing, but politics. So just at that time, the government made the decision, to do the family planning, program. So in the initial period of family planning program, that's the policy is focused on children. It means that the government, propose some idea to tell people that you better have two, that's the best. Even someone hope that people, the family can have one, but that kind of policy is very successful. The fertility decreased very fast from 5.4 in 1970 for each couple for the number of children each couple had, down to 2.2, around 1980. It means that the fertility level decreased very fast. It's decreased even double. So that's why the first period of family planning policy, that's the two-child policy, very successful. Even that, the government still feel that we have strong pressures for the population, so they hope they can do further. This is one of the reasons. Another reason is that you may know that China started economic reform just at that time. That's since 1978, right? So in the beginning of economic reform, the government proposed a target. The target is called that China tried to have 1,000 GDP per capita at the end of the century. 1,000. In 1980s, the GDP per capita in China is less than 300. They have the target that they hope China should reach, the 1,000 GDP per capita, US dollar GDP per capita, at the end of the century. So the people can calculate how many number of population if we try to reach this target. So then someone asked me that we should have to control the population within 1.2 billion at the end of the century. So then there's a scholar, they try to calculate, if we try to reach that target, that's 1.2 billion, how many number of children families would have? So then, there's a very famous scientist who did calculation, they got the result that if each family have 1.7 children on average, from 1980 to year 2000, China, the total number of population will reach 1.2 billion. So the government proposed that we should have one-child policy if we try to control the population within 1.2 billion at the end of the century. So that's why, the government initiate a new policy. That is, that's one-child policy that started in 1980. Once this policy started, then there was also, something happened for the economic reform. That is, in the early of the economic reform, the first step of the reform is agricultural reform. Agricultural reform means that, originally Chinese in agriculture, we call that the collective, we call that a collective owned economy. It means that all the land belong to the collective team. So that's why, when they have the reform, they give the land to each family. That's that kind of things happened at the same time of the one-child policy. Then this kind of policy, the economic policy, increased the birth rate, increased the birth desire that the family in the rural areas they hope to have more number of children, especially for boys. So it's hard for the government to implement a one-child policy at that time. Even the government did a lot. They make a lot of efforts. For example, someone mentioned that is kind of enforced. They try to use some enforcement in order to control the number of population, under the one-child policy. Then, there's a lot of things happen at that time. There's a kind of conflict, a lot of problems caused by the one-child policy. Then, just after 4 years in implementing one-child policy, the government tried to make some decision, tried to do some little bit of relax of the policy, because it's very hard to implement the one-child policy, at that time, especially in rural areas. So, starting in 1984, Chinese government changed something with the policy. That's it. Now we always call that as a 1.5 child policy. It means that, at that time, they still, ask the people who are living in the urban area to have one child. It means that one-child policy has never been changed in urban areas. Then in rural areas, once, a couple, the first child is a boy, they are not allowed to have the second one. If the first child is a girl, they are allowed to have the second. That's on average we call that a 1.5 child policy. So this kind of policy started in 1984. Even that, most of the families they have one child. So that's why even the policy have kind of changing, but we still call it one-child policy because most of people still have one child. This kind of policy, implemented until the end of 2013. In 2013, you may know that the Chinese government started a new policy called that, a parent, if one of them is from one-child family, can be allowed to have the second child. That's the new policy start in the late of 1913. Once this policy start, then we found that there's only a small amount of number of couples apply for have the second child. This means that the number of applications really under our expectation. Originally, Chinese government think that once we release the policy, the people may have more number of children. but the reality is really, different. So within, it's not more than 2 years, the Chinese government released the policy again. That is the end of last year. They started a new policy. We call that two-child policy. This means that allow every family to have say. This is the process of the policy change. Okay. That's all. I just give some brief introduction of the policy change.
Do you want Professor Qiao maybe to say one or a couple more words about why there was that research change? Do you think? I mean, it's obviously a complicated topic. Maybe very brief.
I think the answer is very easy because the fertility in China is quite low.
It is actually evidence-based.
Yes, because the people estimate that the fertility that already be 1.5 now. So that's why 1.5 means that the fertility level in China is quite lower than European countries on average. So that's why even the scholars hope that we have to change our policy because we have quite lower fertility that causes a lot of problems. For example, aging, and also some problems. For example, sex ratio at birth. We have very high sex ratio at birth in China, the highest in the world. And that's mostly caused by to restrict family policy.
Thank you. That's a great
Yes, I think Professor Qiao introduced a large background of policy on the birth control. I really take a close look at the list of discussion, and I think a lot of you are interested on the role of women in this process. So I think I'm going to talk about that. But first, I think the initiation of family planning in China is actually 1964. And the goal is to improve women's health and help them on stopping or have large spacing on bearing children. And at the same time, they can go to work. Because in China, women's labor participation has been always very high. I think it is still among the highest in the world today. And about the population policy, I've seen a lot of discussions on the policy. However, I think in 1970s, the period Professor Qiao talked about that China's fertility dropped very fast. There's actually no exact birth control policy at all. Something I think got less attention is that during that period, nationwide family planning service, free of charge, provided to all women, including rural and urban, and reach every corner of China. And what it does is that contraception rate increased dramatically. And I think from the question I sense there is an assumption that women are passive followers of the policies. However, I think for the most of the time, especially in 70s, they are very grateful to have such a contraception service. Otherwise, you cannot explain how the fertility dropped so fast. Because at that time, both rural and urban women working outside their family, they could not have such a burden to have 6 children at home and working outside. I think that's a large burden. I think if we, looking back to the history, we should pay attention to the contribution of women, what they do to the successful of family planning in China. But I think we underestimate this, and still today. So after this the policy enforced, actually I think it accepted in urban very smoothly, because at the policy enforced in urban, the urban fertility already close to 1. So it is not a big problem, but it has a big conflict in rural area, because at that time the rural fertility about 3, right? Yeah. So it is not, the policy is not agree with the family demand for children, and this cost, I think it costs a lot on enforce it. I have to mention that in 1990s, there's 2 remarkable studies on this period, on the family planning policy and its impact on women. One is done by a team in Xi'an Xiaochun University. It's called Dual Effect of Family Planning on Women. And another is done by a team from China Population and Development Research Center, and they study family planning and women's status. So I think those 2 studies, they found family planning has positive effect on women, improve their status, to give them more choice to stopping having children. So I think this is something we need to know. And the others is they interview the women and men, elderly and young women, looking at what is the impact of family planning in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s on Chinese women. And so I think I'm not going to repeat it here, but I think the effect is very complicated. And also, there's a lot of questions. We were asked a lot of questions by the foreign journalism. Why do you think a lot of people say China changed the family planning policy, birth policy, too late? Why is it? However, I think if a policy is strongly not agree with people's wish, it cannot be last so long. And we had raised the suggestion to the government in as early as 2004. A group of demographers sent a suggestion to the government. It's the time for us to change the birth policy, to relax, because the initial goal of the birth policy is to slow down the fast growth of the population at the micro level and change childbearing behavior of ordinary people. And we can observe since 1990s statistics, those 2 goals are done, are reached, and in some place overachieved. So it is not necessary to keep such a policy anymore. However, why the change delayed for more than 10 years? We think it is not a strong priority either for the government nor for the ordinary people. Because have a second child, we can observe from Professor Qiao said the response to the policy change now is quite, how to say, it is kind of cold. It is not like as warm as the netizens reacted. The couples are very conscious on having second child, especially women, when they balance the work, the career, and childbearing. So looking forward, we think China should be paying more attention on women's need and families' demand on this childbearing and child caring, and especially for women, and to providing more supportive social policy to let the family have the children they wanted, and also for women not to give up their work. I think that's something I did.
Great. Thank you very much. Very helpful. Now we'll pass it on to the Stanford side of the American perspective, Ms. Meredith.
Thank you. Wonderful to hear about China's policy, and really wonderful to hear from both of you. Can you hear me well enough? Good, perfect, great. So I'm going to bring in what I would call a practitioner lens, having been with Planned Parenthood and had a relationship with Planned Parenthood literally for 30 years, since 1985, 2015. I've had a relationship either as a volunteer, a funder, or a senior leader with the organization. And I started my work with Planned Parenthood when I was still in corporate America at AT&T for 10 years, and initially started as a volunteer. And the reason here was very different from what we've heard about in terms of the policy there. There was a proliferation of teen births in our country. Here we were a developed country, but we were not allowing access to birth control for teenagers. They were having sex, but they were not finding a way to protect themselves or have access to contraception. So that was initially how I became involved as a volunteer, working with young women who had to drop out of school because they had a child and could no longer continue their education. But there is much more of a longer history to Planned Parenthood. And let me start by saying there were a number of questions that were proposed. The key to being in balance is knowing when you have lost that balance. And I think today in the United States, the debate around access to birth control, access to women's health, access to abortion has really lost its balance. It has become one of the most, if not the most, polarizing issue in our political debate within our Congress, Senate, and within the presidential debate. That said, 90% of women use birth control. And in fact, Planned Parenthood has, in any given state, even most of the conservative states, anywhere from an 80 to a 90% highest trust rating as an organization. So what we hear about in the political debate is often not representative, I think, of how everyday people feel and how everyday people think about Planned Parenthood and access to reproductive care here in the United States. So there was a question about what is Planned Parenthood, and Planned Parenthood was started by Margaret Sanger, and Margaret Sanger started it in 1916, and here we go into 2016. It will be the centennial anniversary of Planned Parenthood. It was founded because she saw so many poor immigrant women living in New York City, as both of the professors have alluded to, where these women had no access to birth control. And at that time there were not oral contraceptives, but there certainly were condoms available. And that was considered illegal, to actually provide condoms and talk about them. So she was arrested on many occasions. She would see these new immigrant women living in apartments with one bedroom, not 6 or 8 children, but 10 and 12 children. The woman worn out, the family stressed for food, for work, and that really motivated her to actually start Planned Parenthood. Today, Planned Parenthood is an underpinning of women's reproductive health in our country. There is reason to believe that 25 to 35% of women in the United States have used Planned Parenthood at some point in their life, either when they were a teenager and wanted to access birth control without their parents' knowledge, as a low-income person, maybe in between jobs, or just somebody who had no health insurance. We do not have comprehensive universal health care in the United States. So for many people, Planned Parenthood is the first point of entry into the healthcare system. On an annual basis, we have a new group of teenagers entering puberty every day. So there is a need both for education and services, but it also is a place where women continue to go because they trust the confidentiality. Planned Parenthood will see in any given year 3 to 4 million patients. Those women will come in, although men also access often for sexually transmitted diseases. There are over 4 to 5 million women who are engaged in advocacy with Planned Parenthood. There's over 860 clinics in 50 states. The organization is almost $1 billion organization. There is a national organization with Cecile Richards as the president of that organization. And they are engaged in providing medical standards, quality of care, so that whether you go to a Planned Parenthood in Des Moines, Iowa, or San Francisco, California, the quality and standard of care must be the same. About 97% of what Planned Parenthood does is provide birth control, access to health care, primary care, and birth control services, although the debate that you would hear about in Congress related to defunding Planned Parenthood would lead you to believe that all it is about is abortion. That's only about 3%. That said, as abortion services get limited through state legislative access issues, putting waiting periods, that if you come in to say you want to have an abortion, you might have to wait 24 hours, come back. If you live 3 hours away, that causes undue burden. So both the courts at the state and national level, the state legislators have put in so many barriers about access to abortion care. It is making it more difficult. So in those areas, I think where we see Planned Parenthood, probably their percentage of abortion care is increased because fewer providers can do it. Currently, and I think the key to Planned Parenthood's success is what I call a three-legged stool. It's a balance. It's provision of care and services at the local affiliate level, education often to clients who come in and just want information, whether it's about a sexually transmitted disease and how to protect themselves, or birth control, or other related health issues. It's also one of the largest screeners of breast cancer and cervical cancer in our country. So the three-legged stool: services, education, and advocacy. And what we have found for Planned Parenthood is they are some of the strongest advocates and thus the trusted voice of women in our country because they're providing the services and they hear the stories and they see those stories. The reason Planned Parenthood continues to have a strong brand is because of the quality of healthcare, but also as that leading voice, their voice is really saying that we want women, and I think both of the professors said it well, that women want control of their own bodies. They want to be able to make their choices about how many children and spacing of children. And that's really what Planned Parenthood has been about. Some interesting history. In 1949, after World War II, that's when the baby boomers started. So you had a lot of births, and then we went into the 1950s, and women said, gee, maybe, they weren't in the workforce, but in the 1960s, as women joined the workforce, they wanted to have access to birth control, spacing, number of children. Not until 1967, the Griswold versus Connecticut case, was a woman allowed to buy birth control without the consent of her husband. She had to be married. She had to have consent of her husband. So in 1967, that changed so that she could go in and ask for birth control. But really, Planned Parenthood was one of the few places you could get that. In all the way through the 1990s and until kind of the early 2000s, birth control was not reimbursed through health insurance for most women. You had to pay for it on your own. When Viagra came in for men, only at that point in time that it became immediately a part of the health insurance. Jackie Spear, one of our wonderful California congressional members, pushed through and said in California, and then it spread elsewhere, that if insurance was going to provide Viagra for men at no cost or a copay, it needed to provide birth control for women at no cost or a copay. So literally 1998, 2000, 2001, and then push ahead into 2008 until President Obama pushed forward, along with Nancy Pelosi, the Affordable Health Care Act. Women paid more for their health insurance than men. Being a woman was a pre-existing condition. And so you paid more because whenever you had a pre-existing condition, your insurance charged you more. Now that might be a heart condition, but for 51% of the population, being a woman was a pre-existing condition. So that was a very nice outcome from the Affordable Health Care Act. So those are some of the background regarding the question around this recent ongoing controversy. It is religious in nature. In theory, the United States is a secular country. We are not based on any particular religion. And so when contraception or abortion services, which were made legal by the 1973 Supreme Court case, the reality is that it should be a woman's choice. And currently we have congressional members who, for religious reasons, are saying women should not have access. Those who would be in support of women having access to abortion services say it should be up to the woman and her doctor as to what she chooses to do with her body. But it is such a polarizing issue that in recent years, literally the Defund Planned Parenthood campaign by our most conservative congressional members literally shut the government down in 2014 and almost did again this year, and has been threatened again. So defunding Planned Parenthood, and literally what they're talking about is the Title X funding for basic contraception services. That is $280 million out of a trillions and trillions of dollars national budget. So $280 million shutting down the government because some of that money goes to Planned Parenthood. As a board member for the California Family Health Council, where we administer and award the Title X funds for the state of California, that seems a bit extreme to shut down the entire U.S. government because women can access birth control. The federal government has never paid for abortion services in our country, and at this point I certainly can't imagine that they would. So it's always just been about birth control, but the debate would lead you to believe otherwise. And I'm pleased to say that here in California we receive 8% of the Title X funds in the country, but we see 26% of the clients. So I think we're doing a really excellent job, and we have the lowest teen pregnancy. And for many years and I think we still are, the only state that has had reality-based, age-appropriate, mandated sex education. And some other states have sex education, but it is not always mandated or age-appropriate or reality-based. And today, California passed a law, or yesterday, California passed a law that there will be mandated sex education starting in 7th grade that will also include the values discussion around yes, and when yes means yes as it relates to rape, particularly being on a campus where it has become more and more evident that rape on college campuses is also a big issue here in the United States. So those are some background issues, and hopefully that gives you just enough information to keep the conversation interesting.
Thank you very much. Ling, would you like to take all of that, this really interesting conversation, and try to weave it together and maybe have some of your own reactions and probe
Yeah.
further with our panelists?
I'm particularly very interested in like both of the Chinese speakers. So, for example, Xiaochun, professor, weave together, especially this changing family planning policy under economic reform, like the changing type of labor, and especially after 1978 because of the changing economic structure that kind of accompany this family planning policy change. And Professor Zheng talk about the role of women, especially in light of this family planning policy, because when we think about family planning policy, one-child policy, it seems like we're limiting women's ability to kind of have this free will and then kind of force them to have birth control, but it's not that way. It's sort of women also took advantage of this family planning policy as a way to kind of, get on with their own life, have their own planning accordingly. So women, in this sense, some women, I wouldn't say all, are empowered through the using of this contraception. I remember, especially in Taiwan, part of it is also like, about women controlling the family planning and then also like the contraceptions. And from Kim's side, it's also very interesting on the history of the Planned Parenthood from the perspective of free access to birth control, especially focusing on the teen education. And that's I kind of really just wondering, maybe a dialogue, because from your both of you, like I didn't really hear that much, especially on this family planning policy, how it was kind of implemented, how it was kind of educated, because it seems like the teen pregnancy, I'm not sure, is it like a problem, especially in your population policy in that, and then it will be a great conversation kind of to learn more about it. Yeah, and then just any questions or reactions to, yeah.
This is a good question. Actually, we work together with a very large NGO in China, China Family Planning Association. I'm a volunteer of this association and work on the youth project in China. And it actually started in 2002, sometimes around 2002, and I think there's improvement and progress, but there's still some difficulties. About sex education, you mentioned that in school. Well, if you ask the Ministry of Education, they said, yes, we have. However, the sex education in school in I think it is the second year of junior high. It talked about the biology of life, and it talked about fetus, talked about children's grow up, but they never talked about how came sperm met an egg. So this is something very difficult to say in China, and so that caused a lot of problem. And also they don't talk about contraception, and middle school principals very serious is no talking of contraception in my school. But now I think in university is okay, right? And we heard that in Zhejiang University they put the condom deliver machine in the campus and got very good result. And so this is something we are pushing that, the government stated that all the citizens in China have the right to enjoy free contraceptive service. However, that service traditionally only available to married couples. So, it is not written, but it is implemented that way. Suppose no one will have sexual activity before marriage. And we all know it is not true in China. So, so now we are pushing the government to include in the government procurement on the contraception budget to include unmarried youth and to deliver the contraception to them freely, including in their delivery network. So I think this is something going on, and I think one issue I like to mention is that the government take very seriously on reaching the 2030 agenda of sustainable development, and one of the health target of the goal is universal reproductive health service, which including family planning, education, and information, counseling. Well, so I think we are working on that, but still there's a long way to go.
Yeah, and so for Professor Xiaochun, I just have a background questions because when you talk about the changing policy by the end of 2013, and of course of the two-child policy in 2015, but then still, would you, from your research, would you say that are you still seeing more like a decline of the fertility rate, or like would that go up? Because I know that in East Asia country in general, the fertility rate is really low. In Taiwan is lower, much lower. It's not a healthy like population structure. Would you say what are some like underpinning, different forces that's kind of like give shade to this? For example, the young couple right now are kind of afraid to have the second child because they have to bear more burden, the cost of living in the city, and different social constraints. That was kind of unforeseen before 1978. Yeah.
We have already mentioned that since 1990s, China's fertility goes down to below replacement level. Replacement level is mean that the two generations almost equal. The number of two generations almost equal if they have this replacement level. That is 2.1. Then since then, in China, some scholars have already proposed that we should kind of changing the family planning policy because we have already reached lower fertility. Until that, since that time, the fertility still goes down. In 2000 census, the fertility we directly get from the 2000 census is only 1.2. But even a lot of scholars didn't believe this is a real result. Then there was a lot of research dealing with the correction of the fertility level at that time. Then at the census at the 2010 census, the fertility is still lower. That's only 1.18. That's quite lower. So that's why the fertility is quite lower in China than even someone have made some correction that they believe that in China it should be 1.5 around. So the fertility still goes down. Then that's why the government decided that we have to release our policy, then they have their expectation. They hope that fertility can be increasing. But even that, if the government don't try to have the fertility increase very higher. It means that once the government release the policy, they still worry about if the increase will be higher, beyond their expectations. So that's why the government still put some control on the population, even they have already released the policy, since 2013. But I have already mentioned that the number of application for the policy in 2013 is not large enough. It's still a limited number of people provide some application. So that's why the government think that we have to further release the policy. Then once the new policy released, then the government has some expectation. They hope the fertility can be increased higher, even higher than the replacement level. This kind of this is what they expected. Now in normal situation, China have a new birth. New birth each year, that is 16 million. Before the changing of the policy, normally that's 16 million number of new births. Then once the new policy released, the government hope that the total number of births, within the maybe 2 or 3 years to be reached to maybe 21, 22 million, at the most. So that's the kind of expectation. They hope that the fertility can reach to maybe 2.2 around. Then the situation is that once the total number of births increased to the peak, then this will go down afterwards. For the scholars, we hope that we should keep the fertility around replacement level. But I think that the reality should be quite lower than we expected. So that's the situation in the future, that even we release policies, and the total number of births can be increased little bit within maybe 3 or 5 years, and finally this will be increased.
So,
that's the general situation. Yeah.
So I'd like to jump in here, and for our students, and possibly for our American students who may know a little bit less, I know certainly some of the issues were newer to me as we started to do work in China, even though I've been sort of in this space around women's reproductive health. What was interesting back in March of 2014, we do our March programming, and often it's a mix of scholars, practitioners, and leaders, so nonprofit leaders, business leaders, foundation leaders, and scholars. But on one of our days, we did a very just kind of closed door scholar workshop. And we had 24 scholars from China who presented different work. And one of the scholars from Peking University School of Governance actually presented on this new policy that is supposed to go into effect in 2016. I think it was called like the 96-4 policy, but really what that's about is that you have 2 young Chinese people, millennials, who get married. They each have 2 parents who are alive, and they have at least 1 grandparent who's alive. So what happens is you have these 2 young people who are in their 20s or 30s who are essentially supporting 6 adults. And so when we talk about replacement value or replacement numbers of population. It's really it's an economic conversation that the same way here in the United States, we have lower fertility today. People say, how are we going to support Social Security? We have less people paying into it, more people wanting to collect Social Security. Who's going to support it? And so we've got two young people who get married, who have two parents, who have two grandparents, in this case, who are often alive. And so what happens is these two people are in theory supporting 6 or 8 people. So this is what this tension is about. And as China re-examines its one-child policy, it's really about the government can no longer support all of those people who need elderly care, and what this policy essentially talked about, and whether in fact it goes into effect or not, you would know better than I. But what was discussed was that if 75% of elderly care had been underwritten or essentially paid for by the government, that in 2016, that would almost flip, that 75% of elderly care would be expected to be paid for by the family, and 25% of the people who were poorer, then the government would pay for that. And whether in fact that goes into effect or not, I think that sort of frames the issue in a really good way for all of us to understand. And it's the same here in the United States around Social Security. Who's going to pay for Social Security? At what age should it go into effect? So conversations about raising the age. We also have Medicare. So if you're over 65, you do have access to health care. But if you're under 65, you typically get it through your employer, or now 50 million people are able to access it through the Affordable Health Care Act and these health insurance cooperatives, collectives, and pools. So it's a lot about economic issues and who's going to pay for what and how many people can afford to do that. And that also has been this sort of interesting conversation as we get into some of these broader issues around the number of children and policy-related issues. That's one. Two, a second issue, though, really still has to do with the value of women. And the professor brought it up when he said if there was first child was a boy in the rural area, then they would not have a child. If the first child was a girl, then it was all right to have a second child. And we've also seen a lot of missing girls globally after birth, either just missing after birth, fed less and not able to develop, and a lot of other issues. And so while it's more stark in many countries of the world, in the United States it comes out in different ways about Congress wanting to control what women can do, what decisions they can make. As men might feel loss of control, then how do we control the feminization of our society in some ways? So sort of the economic and then sort of that human rights issue, I think, is also just something to think about.
Yeah, Professor Qiao and Zhenzhen, Professor Zheng, do you have like any reflections or like, comments back to Kim's like presentation and questions?
Yeah, I think the women's perspective is very important because at the end it's the women who bearing the children, right? And so when you're looking at the economy in China, the men's labor participation of almost 100%. So there's no way to dig it out. But women still we have the potential. So I think everything focuses on women now, both economically or demographically. However, I think if we're looking at the population policy, it is never a population issue it alone. And even though we change the policy today, I think I delivered a background figures. China's population trend will not change in the 21st century. We will aging, we will have less labor, and we will have less children. And this is definitely the women who are going to give birth to children already born. So we can predict in the future, although the policy change, there is not an impact on change the trend. So when talking about, we call it 4-to-1 family structure, well, maybe not 4-to-1, maybe 6-to-2, something like that, but that trend is definitely our fate in the 21st century. So I think from the implication of policy relaxation, I think if we think it more from women and families level, I think it is more rational to let the family have more choice, to let women have more choice. However, women now, as I interviewed the women in the last 2 years, it looks like they are more caught between the family's demand to have another child and to quit my job to have another child. So a lot of women just hesitate to make that decision. I think that is something, I think this situation have been discussed in the high level very seriously. I'm glad the government have that perspective also.
I try to give some response about the social support, because of the aging in China, this is a really big issue that, there's a lot of discussion not only in China but in the world. I think that most of you may know that, the proportion of the elderly in the world, is increasing. The highest, in the world, that's in Japan. Japan have, now it's around 27% of the people whose age is 65 plus. That's the highest percentage in the world. In the United States, that's only 14%. For the elderly whose age is 65 plus. In China, that's 10. Even this level is not quite higher, but because of family planning policy, this kind of percentage should be increased very fast in the future. So that should be very serious problems in China. Just because of this, Chinese government started to do the pension reform since the late 1990s. Originally I mentioned that China was under a planned economy. In the planned economy, they have different pension system. This means that the government provide all the support to the people. Once they retired, the government paid everything. The people don't need to pay anything. Before the reform. So since 1997, the Chinese government started pension reform. This means that originally, the pension was given by the enterprises. Then since then, the Chinese government tried to, set up a social pension system. Because the Chinese government already know that, we are aging. If we have an old system, that we call, pay-as-you-go system. The pay-as-you-go system means that the current young people have to pay, and the current elderly, receive their pension. They call the pay-as-you-go system. So this kind of system, face a lot of problems. Most of the countries in the world, use this kind of system. So Chinese government tried to learn something from that. They tried to set up a new pension system. They combine the pay-as-you-go system with another new system called fully funded system. This kind of system was proposed by World Bank. There's some of successful cases from South America, some country from South American countries. So that's why Chinese government tried to use a new system. The problem is that we still I don't want to say something in detail about the system. The problem is that China, because China stepped from planned economy into market economy. almost all the system has to be reconstructed. So that's the problem. Because originally China almost had no pension system. It's an end market economy. Then, the new systems only covered a limited number of population. Originally we have enterprises pension system. Started in 1997. Then even in middle of 1990s, China government started a rural pension system. Then this kind of system failed. Then the end of the old rural pension at the end of 1998. Then with 10 years, there was no pension system in rural areas. Then we have a new rural pension system started in 2008. So that's why now in China it seems the coverage is very universal, but the level, supported by the pension is very limited. So that's a problem. Another problem is that in China, the government still propose that, the taking care of the elderly should be the duty of the family. This is different as other countries. In other countries, in Western countries, mostly, you may know that, you based on the social system rather than family. But in China, we really, rely on the family. So that's why that is the problem in China, because we have no children. Then we have a limited amount of pension supported to the people. So, we have the problems that the government, originally proposed that, implementing family planning is the duty of the family. This kind of word was written in the constitution in China. And also in China, we also have a law dealing with the security of the elderly. They also mentioned that, taking care of the elderly is also the duty of the family. This means that the young people have to already implement responsibility for having one child, but also, we still have the responsibility to take care of our elderly. So that's kind of conflict. That's the problems in China. So that's why in the future, I think that we cannot, rely on the family because we have no resources. That is the children to support their elderly, but we have to rely on the government. But unfortunately, in China, we have no such kind of social pension system provided by the government. So I think that is a very big challenge in the future in China.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would like to bring Kim's insight on this, especially about family planning, the Planned Parenthood, because the role of family, like in the United States, like how does that like shifted? How does that like change policy? That we could kind of create a dialogue in the ideas of the family.
Sure. Both of you made such great observations, and I think the role of the family that you talked about is very much a problem here in our own country, and we call it the sandwich generation. And if you're the sandwich generation, you have your children, you have yourself and your partner, and then you have your parents that you're taking care of. And as in China, we have had mobile family and people moving into other areas, often moving away from their family and then potentially coming back. And then in theory, people have not had that value of as you grow old, you take care of your parents. So I think some of the cultural norms, as you have described them, certainly we are challenged by those issues without doubt. And so we are challenged by them also in terms of policy, that when we look at Social Security, for most people, it's not enough to really live on, and we have fewer people paying into it, so how are we going to sustain it? So there's both how do you encourage people to save for themselves and their retirement? How do you pay for the Social Security that they've paid into? And then how do you care for your family? Now, there's a really interesting news study that just came out in the past month. And now that this has come up, I'll have to go back and look at it. But it's a new study, and maybe just in the past 2 weeks, where we've always talked in terms that families are not nearby, and therefore taking care of elderly or being near parents. In the past, probably from the 1970s until recently, the observation was that people lived away. You might have been born in California, or you might have been born in Iowa, but you moved to California for a job, or to New York for a job, because that's where a lot of the economic activity was. But there's a new study out that says that people are living much closer to home. It was called How Close Do You Live to Your Mother? And that it was a very, I don't know if either of you saw this, but probably just within the past 2 weeks to a month, a whole new study about how that shift has happened in the United States, and that in fact people do live close to their families. So maybe that's something we can have optimism about, that people will be closer, that they can be a part of their family's aging, but also that grandparents can be a part of their children and their grandchildren, so that we can create more of these intergenerational relationships, which typically lead to stronger families. Particularly as women continue to manage their fertility, have 1 or 2 children, and then they can have grandparents nearby to enjoy, but also help with childcare. We still have very minimal child care policies here in the United States. You can get some tax reimbursements. Maternity leave, yes, you can do that. When I started working in corporate America, women got 4 weeks off, and then if they had a C-section, maybe 6 to 8 weeks. Today you can have 2 months, 3 months. You can go up to 6 months, depending on how much you're willing to pay on your own or pay into. So some of it is reimbursed by your company, and some of it you can just take time off without pay, if you will. So family leaves, maternity leaves, child care issues, all of these play into it. And so maybe the good news is if we live closer to our families, we can all be a part of that as we look ahead. Because I agree with you, I don't think women are going to give up their right to not have choices on number of children and spacing of children. They value that. They want to control their own body. And so I think that's definitely something that is in conversation today, but I think women will ultimately step up and step out and lead that conversation in terms of policy. One other comment I would say after the 1990 census, the census determines congressional members, and when you have, like in 1990, 2000, 2010, when you get those new numbers, it's always an opportunity for new congressional seats. And in the 1990s, it led to a very kind of an immediate growth of women in Congress. And as a result of that, money was invested into breast cancer research, into equality related to clinical trials for drugs. Still, we have a very low number of women. It's only about 16% of our representatives are women in the United States, and that is very low and actually probably shameful. So we need to encourage women to feel they can be a part of the political debate and discussion, because when they are, policies reflect that. When it drops back down to 13% or 16%, policies reflect that. When it spikes up, we have better policy for women.
So just to add to that, I'm also thinking about, besides the family, about how the care work is being paid and who is actually taking care of those care work, especially for the elderly and then for the children. So women's care work at home are usually not paid. As perceived as general as a woman's not second shift or a different burden at home in addition to work. So I think like Professor Qiao and also Professor Zheng also point out like very important issue in the social policy that kind of support both parents, grandparents, and also the children in order to kind of facilitate this more healthy environment, encourage them to have children so they don't have to worry that much what are the consequences of having children. So I'm thinking about opening up the floor for questions from our audiences, especially for this very interesting dialogue between the US and China. So.
Questions or comments?
I actually had something. I was curious if we could revisit the some of the stigma surrounding contraception. And I'm more familiar with where that comes from, what it's rooted in on the US side. But we know that there isn't quite the same religious context in China driving that. So I was wondering if both sides could introduce to the other what the stigma against contraception, where that comes from in the country, and how it has kind of persisted or started to wane in the years since.
Okay, I think this is totally a different story from between China and the US. I think because I also have participated in some activities in the International Planned Parenthood Federation, and then I heard those stories in the Western Hemisphere, and so I think it is very different. In China, ordinarily, contraception is okay, induced abortion is okay. If you're looking back to the history of China, actually a newborn will not celebrate until 100 days, even not giving a name. Well, I think one of the reasons is that very high neonatal infant mortality, and another reason is I think they're not really seen as a real human being. It's not like do a induced abortion is killing something alive. They're looking at the mother's, the women's life more seriously than the fetus. I think this is the difference. And there's no religious obstacle to contraception. So in China, there's a large variety of contraceptions: condom, pill, injectable, and female condom, and IUD is most popular. I think 60% is IUD, and I know in a lot of Latin American IUD is not allowed. And sterilization is a small part. So even in the places I visited, in the Muslims, they don't have any feeling against contraception. Even the imams talked about the contraception to women and said if this is good to women's health, then it will be good. So I think in China, luckily we don't have this problem.
So I think in the U.S., certainly it's much more recent. I would say it really wasn't, I don't think it was a big debate until kind of the 1990s. Certainly when in 1967 there was the Griswold versus Connecticut case that allowed women to have access to contraception. And I think that was more just the cultural norms were such that you had sex when you were married at that time, and I think cultural norms were shifting, and the reality is that you weren't always married, and that access to birth control should be available, and more importantly, should not receive the consent of your husband. So that was sort of one. Two, you had Roe versus Wade, Supreme Court case that basically said, it was a woman's right to choose when she had an abortion, and the courts came up with a legal timeline, if you will, when a fetus was a fetus versus a fetus being sort of a human life and live person. A fetus is a fetus until it's born. When it's born, it becomes a human being. That said, there are certain religions, and certainly I think I can say safely that the Pope and the Catholic Church still believes that essentially at conception, that means when the sperm and the egg meet, it is now a human being, and therefore it is a life to be protected, and that would be their point of view. Science might argue differently than that, and I think women ultimately, if it's good for women's health, as the professor has just said, and if we value the woman's life more than the fetus, we would allow the woman to either have an abortion if, for various reasons, birth control did not work and that person didn't have access, or there was a complication in the pregnancy and that a woman needed to have that choice with her doctor to terminate the pregnancy. And those are really quite rare in those cases. And again, as I said, 3% of what Planned Parenthood does is abortion, and the reality is women will always access abortion. The real issue is it safe and is it legal? It's not going to reduce abortions when you make it illegal. People will just go to an unsafe situation. I do think a lot of it has to do with religious Western policy, and additionally to abortion, certainly the Pope also said, and continues to have said, that access to contraception should not be a part of a woman's life. That said, certainly Catholic women do access birth control. So I think there's sort of this historical, religious, Catholic perspective. I think as the church has gone through some questions around modern society, they are asking themselves questions about that, so we'll see where that leads. But it certainly has led to forgiveness around divorce, opening up to some people who are interested in same sex, or to gay, lesbian, bisexual folks, at least in terms of conversation, and welcoming them to the Catholic Church. So we'll see where that leads. And then the evangelical far right also has connected into that and viewed creationism over evolution, scientific evolution, and thus on religious grounds said that birth control or abortion should not be legal. That said, again, 90% of women in the United States access some sort of birth control, and so we'll see where that leads. What women do in private by getting a shot every 3 months, where nobody needs to know to control their own fertility. Clearly that's going on, even though maybe the men in their lives have a different perspective.
I have a follow-up.
Idea just like the professor referred, I think the education level play a key role in our today's topic. Because as we can see, in China, even the rich family have no children, but in the mountain area or the west of China, many families have 3, even more children. So I think in the future, no matter how much the government try to do or try to improve, through the education level improving, the number of children in China in the future must be decreased, just like the Japan, like the Germany. So I want to answer. So thank you.
You ask us
Just a comment.
or just a comment? Is a question or a comment? Okay.
Or is your question?
Maybe
I
ask it in
think
Chinese.
it is highly related to not only education, but also economic development and social development, and especially for women's non-agricultural employment. As I observed in rural area, if the women engaged in non-agricultural employment, she have a strong autonomy, strong feeling to control what she wants.
I think it's not just because a burden of support the family or the children. It's also about opinion change. Just for me, I think in the future, I just want one child. If it's a girl, it's I think it's really changed in some young people in China. Our opinion is really changing. So I think in the future, it's not about the politics, not about the government. It's just about our lifestyles is really changing.
I agree with that. I don't overestimate the policy effect of the government.
So I have a question for Ms. Meredith. So you mentioned in your opening remark that the topic, the issue related to those contraception, abortion, and birth control has been not so polarizing. Has not been such a polarizing topic in American environment. But meanwhile, we have noticed that some politicians, maybe some kind of Republican politicians, they may have launched some opinions that even if a woman is raped and gets pregnant, it is not moral for she to get abortion. Yeah, but it is contradictory with your opinion that it is not a polarizing topic. So I wonder, what is the power that support those politicians' opinions? And is it really true that most of the people in America believe that it is a woman's free choice to get abortion? Is it really true? Or there are still many people in America who believe that abortion is immoral, it's not a secular?
Thank you for the question. In fact, what I said was that the issue was not polarizing in the 1970s or 80s, but in the 1990s and through today, the issue is very polarizing. And in fact, we see that, as you've described beautifully, the type of polarization, and it has become sort of the topic of the decade, if you will, both in our Congress and Senate, and certainly in this presidential election, but also in the 2008 and 2012 presidential election. So it is polarizing, and that said, I think poll after poll, and there was yet another one, shows that most Americans, and depending on what question you ask, probably about 60% of Americans believe women should have access to abortion, sort of just they should have access. There might be some limitations, but I think then you get into maybe some restrictions, maybe a few more percentages there. But in general, contraception, I think very high support for that from the population. Again, if you poll people, 90% of women use contraception at some point in their lives. So what we hear about in our political debate and what's actually happening in people's lives, it's hard at times to imagine that these ultra-conservatives that are speaking out in our Congress, I'm not quite sure who's voting for them, but clearly somebody is. That has really has polarized our country. And some of that might have to do with our election system. That what has happened is you have districts, and so we have primaries, and in the primary elections, if you're sort of a middle-of-the-road candidate that can kind of well, get along with both sides, then you're not appealing to the far right or not appealing to the really progressive liberals. So what happens is you get the most liberal running against the most conservative, and then you end up with that representation in Congress at the local level. And so that has become polarizing rather than bringing people into the middle and finding ways to support people who say, maybe I don't believe in abortion, but it's not my role to judge what you do. We have laws that say you can access it, and I can respect that you might have a different religious belief than I do. So in a secular society, I can support that. That would be the kind of politics you would want to see coming out, or some of the language coming out. But we have sort of found ourselves with these two polarized views. And I do not think it represents the everyday people. And certainly not women.
And Stephen, we had someone who wanted to jump in on this side, if we could.
Yeah.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Oh, sure. Going back to the contraceptive question from earlier, Professor, you mentioned that you kind of gave us the idea that, in China, contraception and abortion are okay, and they're not really polarized topics like we were just discussing. But earlier you also mentioned that in many schools, when it comes to sex education, contraception isn't even brought up. So I was just curious if you can clarify on that, maybe.
Yeah, because the marital status. Well,
okay.
I said traditionally in China, we assume you can only have sexual activity after you get married.
Okay.
So all the surveys providing covers all married couples, but not unmarried youth. So this is not we are trying to change on the institutional level to recognize this world is not like that anymore.
Right.
And they still haven't changed. It's still.
Well, there's change unwritten. We want it to be clear. There's change. They already, for example, for induced abortion service and contraceptive delivery, they don't ask if you're married or not. But however, we want it to be clear, and we want it to be in the budget of the government.
So on that topic, in 2000, when President George W. Bush became president, he instituted abstinence-only education, and those were the only federal funds for sex education. And so California was the only state, 1 out of 50, that did not accept those funds, because we had a law on the books here that mandated age-appropriate, reality-based sex education. Now, maybe it was only in the high schools and not in the junior highs, but it was very clear. And it was an outcome of the AIDS epidemic that started in San Francisco, and as a result of that, people supported it. And it was actually Republican Governor Pete Wilson who instituted that. So California did not accept those funds 2000 through 2008, and all the other states accepted those funds. Their teen pregnancy went up, gonorrhea and chlamydia went up. When I was working in New York at the national office for Planned Parenthood Federation in 2006-07, we worked with MTV and did some pretty fun campaigns with MTV. But 1 in 4 girls had chlamydia or gonorrhea. 1 in 2 girls in the African American or the Hispanic community had gonorrhea or chlamydia. So of course the poor, low income, or those without access to education are always the most at risk. In 2006, fast forward, a group of about 16 governors, of which most of them were Republicans, rebelled and said, oh my gosh, this abstinence-only education is not good for our children in our states, because they are getting pregnant, they are getting sexually transmitted diseases. There was a well-known report, Congressman Waxman out of Los Angeles, the Waxman report, that documented all of this and basically said abstinence-only education might delay the first sexual activity by 6 months, But when they had the sexual activity, they didn't know how to protect themselves, whether it was against a sexually transmitted disease or teen pregnancy. Since then, in 2008, sex education funding from federal funding, at least in the first 4 years of the Obama administration, pushed out and made for reality-based, but said, fine, go ahead and talk about abstinence too, but it can't be exclusive to abstinence. I think with some of the congressional legislation that's gone on in the most recent 2 to 4 years, it's hard to know exactly what they are funding or not. But generally, that to me was a great example of how education affects an entire generation of children who were in high school from 2000 to 2006 and into 2008. And we saw that with Stanford students coming in, not aware of all of the facts. And I think if you see it here, you're going to see it anywhere. So we probably have some of the most fortunate kids in terms of access to information.
I saw a question in the back.
Yeah, I was just wondering about like China's teen pregnancy rate, because as you said, there's not too many education. Well, I went to middle school in Beijing Jingsheng 学校, so like I was fortunate enough to have a very good like sex education, like as early as 2004 and 2005. The teacher brought in condoms and like talked about AIDS and other STD and STI stuff, and I was very lucky. I know other schools may not have the same situation, and I heard a lot about like girls very young and they go to hospital to try to get abortion, and then there were issues about that. So could you elaborate on that?
Unfortunately, we don't have the statistics on teen pregnancy because it is not a good thing to report. So when we do a survey, we asked, have you ever had sexual activity and have you ever pregnant? Well, usually in the high school, usually the boys reported, more boys reported they have sexual activity. We wonder with whom. That's the situation. So we can't get that information. However, we got the information from maternal and child health center and the family planning clinics. The teenagers do abortion. It's not a big proportion on the induced abortion clients. So they are. It's like this. Everybody talk about it, and somebody have real activity, but when they really get pregnant and go to induced abortion, it is very serious problem, but it is not so high. However, I think it draw attention of the government last year, and I know that the National Commission on Health and Family Planning launched a project last year on a pilot on 6 cities in China, aiming at reducing teenager-induced abortion, unwanted pregnancy and induced abortion. We are trying, but however, the problem is that this is something very secret happened, and the girls now won't talk about it to anybody, only to her friends. And so we need to catch, we need to evaluate when to have this education is more appropriate, because we have a very strong social resistance on that also. The parents not happy about we talking about contraception in school. Well, you are lucky. You're in Beijing. You're going to the school. The young people I interviewed in Chongqing, all the young people graduated from Chongqing, local Chongqing young people. They know more about it than the migrants. They come to Chongqing to work from surrounding rural area. So they have knowledge, they have information, and they know where to get condom. They know how much emergency contraception costs and pill costs, and then they know where to get them. They know everything. But young people, young migrants, they have less knowledge. So now the focus in a lot of cities is on the migrant workers, preventing unwanted pregnancy.
I'd like to quick respond about her questions. The Jingsan school is a very special case because in the early of 1990s, UNIPA have support the China program that's called sex education in middle school. At that time they set up some of the parallel schools to start education of sex education. As far as I know, Jingsan school is the most important school who receive this kind of program.
Then
Yeah.
they have very good
Yeah.
principle.
Then this is
The principle is the gatekeeper.
this is kind of individual case. In that time in the early 1990s, because of the program, there's a lot of middle school in China. They have the sex education. And even the Ministry of Education have already proposed some of suggestion to put some materials in the textbook of the middle school. At that time, after program stopped, that's in the late of 1990. Then I think that most of the middle school they stopped sex education since then. Then only some of school maybe they're later in this school they still realize that it's a very important program. They still keep this program. Then you still have this kind of education. None other.
I'm looking at the time, we're starting to get close to the end, but maybe we can just, I saw there were two questions, maybe we can just ask them together, and then we'll have a quick yeah.
Okay, my question is about the policy that has an impact on the women's role changing in the family, and it's not only for the Chinese condition, it's also about, a question for Ms. Kim, because as you've mentioned that 100 years ago, there was the first mention of Planned Parenthood, and during the century, does this has any impact on the role changing of women in the family? And besides, in China, once we have the birth control policy and the women go to work and their voice are more being heard in the family and they play a more important role in decision making in family, and the second child, will it change the role for women in family?
Yeah, I got some question about new policy, two-child policy in China. So I think from my understanding, the basic rationale of Chinese new second-child policies because of China's weakened demographic bonus, so which gives less return to economic growth. And as Mr. Qiao said, this is going to have a very significant delay in this policy because now we see a very low application of this policy. So from your perspective, of course I know that China and the United States have two systems, have two cultural background and different way of policy decisions. So I think would you give me some indication or suggestion like the United States face this problem that the policy, this one demographic policy doesn't work before. So how does the United States solve this problem? Any suggestion on that which could solve some problem that are faced now in China? Yeah, thank you.
So maybe we'll use this as a way to kind of conclude with final remarks from our two panelists.
Great. Were there any final questions here?
I have one. One thing I'm interested in is what sort of, on both sides, what sort of, voice there is from, regular women. I guess we talked about this weird disconnect. I would have thought that on the American, in America, there would the policy would be much more in line with sort of public opinion, the general prevailing views than in China. But it seems like we've talked about that being the opposite way around, and given the way the two governments work, I would have thought that would be the opposite way. So what sort of voice do people have? Sort of regular people, how do people organize, especially, how do women organize, what kind of influence can they actually have on policy in both countries is something I'm really interested in.
Great. What order would you like us to go in?
Okay, I think the decision making in China has been changing, and we are still changing. And I came back to Beijing in 1992. I studied in the U.S. and so compared to 20 years ago, I think now the policy making is more evidence oriented. There's a lot of projects going on. I don't think we have the same system, but I think the way and the feeling of eager to know the truth, I think is the same. So I think Professor Qiao mentioned that he had a lot of projects. A lot of projects are given by the government to ask the scholars to collect information and evidence from the field. And so we submit a report to the government, and I think the latest evidence is the two children policy change. It is not as expected before. Before they said that when there's a first step of birth policy reform, they said we need to say 3 to 5 years to see the result. And then last year, there's a lot of evidence presented to the government, and the government realized it is safe to have the second step very soon. So I think those are the evidence-based, and my institute have a lot to do with economics, and they have been generating reports and attending consulting meetings, and go to the field and go to the business enterprises. And so I think this decision making is more and more a evidence based decision making. Well, I think this is something different than 20 years ago.
Okay, I think that he proposed very good questions. In China, the final decision was always made by the government. But the people and even the scholars have already have done a lot to push the government to release the policy. I think that originally, as Professor Zheng mentioned, that the Chinese government may not quite release the policy as early as the reality. But as the people and even the scholars, they propose a lot of suggestions, not only through the formal China, but also from the internet and the government. We make a lot of push to the government to change the policy as early as possible, and finally the government really release the policy. But is it really even under all expectations? I thought that the government may change the two-child policy maybe next year and even later, but suddenly we found that suddenly we found that the government starts to releasing the policy as early as our expected. That's mean that we did a lot. Even the people did a lot for pushing the government to release policy.
And sometimes for the media, I think sometimes very strong voice may not be real people's voice. Because we heard very strong voice on the website, but however, those are not the people they are going to give childbirth.
Even from other countries.
Exactly. So I'll just conclude with a couple of comments. One, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. I think the key to being in balance is knowing when you're out of balance. And I think, really to your question right now, I think we recognize that to a certain extent, what we hear in the policy debates is a bit out of balance with what the everyday people, and in particular what women's voices are talking about and how they vote and how they advocate. Certainly, if we look back and a little bit to the questions in the back of the room there, the women's role has changed since 1967, changing role of the family. We saw sort of the growth of feminism, Gloria Steinem, women taking control of their lives, their bodies, entering into the workplace. But the reality is, we still, while we've had access to birth control and access to women's health, and it has been something we can access, the reality is abortion became legal, contraception was legal, and to a certain extent, I think a lot of people thought, oh, it's done. We've kind of solved the problem. I think what we forgot along the way, and this is what we see coming up, is that people who have access get comfortable and they don't feel they need to advocate or be out there talking about it. So, oh, that was your generation's issue, like my generation's issue. And now I think millennials and Gen X and Gen Y are looking and saying, oh my gosh, this has to be my issue now too. I thought it was kind of done. I thought things were legal and we had access. But as we see over 500 different legislative introductions into different state legislatives to put restrictions on abortion or make the egg a human or whatever it might be, not allow access to teenagers, not allowing confidentiality for birth control services. There are many ways that through legislation we see this surfacing. And I think millennials and Gen X and Y are stepping up and realizing that this is an important underpinning to their personal freedoms and how they think. And so I'm very optimistic that they will mobilize and that they, since when we do polling, we know how they feel, we need them to step out and become a part of that and be active in the next presidential election and the next congressional and Senate elections. And really look at how their lives are impacted by policy, that it is not something that is over there. In fact, it affects your everyday access and decision making. So I am optimistic that your generation, in fact, will engage in this next election. And tonight, our president is giving his last State of the Union speech as we speak here. I hope you will go back and listen to it because I'm sure some of these issues will come up. There is no doubt about it that every Republican candidate has said they want to defund Planned Parenthood, they are against birth control and anti-choice, and every Democratic candidate has said they support Planned Parenthood, they support women's access to birth control and access to choice. So there is a clear delineation, and for better or worse, it is polarizing. It has become about religion, and that, in my mind, is unfortunate. But I think we need to step out, not be afraid, and really have our voices be heard, because we are the people. We have the incredible right to representation. We live in a democracy, and we need to exercise our right as citizens.
Very inspiring. If I say a final word of thanks, Ling, would you like to say anything as a final word?
Yeah, I'm very inspired by like both sides dialogue. It was kind of way beyond our imagined because like since Luke and James we in touch and last week because we want to create a dialogue, especially exchanges, and see like these reflection could work with each other's experiences, and I think we have achieved that today. So I'm like really thankful for all these very inspiring and very amazing dialogue. Yeah, and thank you, Stephen, for facilitating that, and Professor Qiao and Professor Zheng. Yeah.
And may I?
And I just
I was just saying, and may I give you a personal invitation? Every one of you over there, mark your calendars. Stanford at Peking University, March 16th. We'll start the day with Paul Bress talking about impact investing. We'll go into some corporate social responsibility, socially responsible investment. You are all welcome to join us that day, March 16th. So please be there.
Thank you. We've all marked it down.
Good.
Great.
I just want to say, just reaffirm and say thank you. Thank you, really, everyone, for really a great conversation, and especially thank you our three wonderful panelists, Professor Qiao, Professor Zheng, Ms. Meredith, for just such illuminating and a wonderful discussion. And to do this, across 2 continents, 2 time zones, 2 different places, 2 cultures, 2 contexts, is really an incredible and really unique experience that I think that through Faces that we've been able to host, and hopefully to provide some ways forward, thinking about some of the big questions ahead, whether it's policy, culture, possibility of social change, and the importance of keeping in mind the people, the everyday people that James raised in mind. So thank you everyone, thank you Henley, thank you to the audience for such great questions on both sides. It's great to be able to see each other, on two sides. And also especially so thanks to the organizers on the Beida side and the Stanford side for such a great job. So thank you guys, and it's a great event. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to make a note. There's actually we got Oren's hummus. I don't know if any it's like Mediterranean food. It's sitting out right outside the door of the library to your right as soon as you exit. So you're welcome.
Great.
You're welcome to come eat food.
You'll be able to get that
I
information
know.
too. I know.
Yeah,
I'd
I
love
will
to
get
have
there.
all of them.
Yeah,
Terrific.
they're really
Great. Thank you.
Taking down my camera, putting it like I'm just
Congratulations. That was so much fun.
Thank you, Stephen.
Not a problem.